I practice medicine. It's a very soft science. It's very complex to take care of living organisms. We don't practice medicine at the biochemical level. We do not practice molecular medicine. We push a little here, we give a little this, we do a little that. And basically what we do is constantly adjust on the fly. I teach residents how to practice emergency medicine, which means on the fly in an urgent situation. You know, I've thought about this. I'm disabled by the fact that I'm no good at calculus. Complex things do not really, they don't get into my brain. The problem is we're dealing with a scientific community that's very capable of taking on very complex things and creating very complex modeling. They ought to learn a little bit about practicing medicine. The climate is like a living organism. It's not homogeneous. It doesn't fit what they understand to be science, and they can't adjust themselves to it. When it comes down to it, that's what struck me about the things that have happened the last couple of days. We're talking about real hard science, but we're talking about a very complex thing that's very hard to fit into most people's understanding of how you do science. And as a result, there's a disconnect. The Malthusian virus includes another virus that was talked about at the previous talk. We talked about Western civilization guilt and our inability to live with the fact that we essentially are all involved in relatively self-interested kinds of activities. And as a result, the environmentalists have got us because we've been taught by our parents, by religion, to feel guilty that we aren't constantly sacrificing for the rest of society. That's the kind of thing that drives a person like Warren Buffett, who makes a tremendous amount of money, but talks like a socialist. Makes sense, doesn't it? Miss Nova studied molecular biology and has now become a TV educational guru and also a person who has designed and developed curricula for science education. We were talking about the failure of the educational system yesterday. I think she'll have a few things to say about that. But I would suggest to you that Antonio Gramsci wanted the kind of educational system that we have now. Ignorant people who can be moved around with no knowledge of science and, in fact, very little knowledge of history. Ms. Nova.
Thank you. I should add that I have not been involved in the curriculum development. I think that's come from the fact that I've performed to about 50,000 school students in Australia, travelling around popping lids off tins and blowing up marshmallows and useful things like that to explain physics and science and angular momentum to 5-year-olds. So that's my involvement with the education system. I wrote the Skeptics Handbook, which you should have in your file, which came out of me travelling around Bali for the UNFCCC conference. I was with David Evans, my husband, and Christopher Monkton and Craig Rucker, and a great crowd, 12 skeptics versus 12,000 believers. So this is the message that we distilled it down to, essentially, the things that the skeptics had to know and the answers we needed to have. Obviously, we've got to update it every year, so I'm going to be doing a new one again, I imagine, soon, to try and keep up with the way the argument keeps changing. I'm here to talk about the fact that there's not much global warming, but there is a lot of global fawning. We find it in my profession, science communicators, which covers journalists, it covers people who teach at schools, it covers radio announcers, commentators, TV personalities, anyone who explains science, so bloggers as well, including the DSMOG team and others who explain science. We need to raise the standards of science communication. Our profession has let everyone down. I'm going to talk about New Scientist today, partly because it's my favourite magazine and partly because they're the ones who lead the march in terms of global warming and, unfortunately, in terms of the rush to the dark ages. They put out 170,000 issues each week, subscriber base, 170,000. They go out weekly across the world, and they're republished in papers like The Australian, so they matter. When 60 Minutes came to our house to interview David Evans, which is my husband, they rang up beforehand, and one of the questions they asked was, what does New Scientist have to say about this? So it tells you about the influence of this magazine. Unfortunately, New Scientist has quietly become non-scientist, censoring the science, giving us one-sided coverage, not standing up for the whistleblowers but defending big business and big bureaucracy instead, and not standing up for free speech. It's unfortunately turned out to be the last place you'd expect to find logic and reason. Where's the balance in New Scientist? I did a keyword search in their archives. They have a beautiful archive system. 5,800 mentions of global warming, 2,000 mentions of the greenhouse effect, and the other major contender as an alternative explanation, the cosmic ray theory, has 3 mentions. So there is no balance here. They also said millions will be spent testing whether cosmic rays can form cloud condensation nuclei, even though some regard this as a waste of money. Here's a magazine supposed to be at the leading edge supporting scientists, and their opinion, because there's no some there, some people are unquoted, unnamed, presumably the other people in the office sitting around as they had morning tea, regarded as a waste of money to do further primary research into something that they call the greatest threat to humanity. And they don't want to put money into doing more research on finding the cause, because it's inconvenient if it is the cause, cosmic rays. They mix cause and effect up. This is a graph they published in 1989. The caption down the bottom's hard to read. I'll blow it up for you. Where carbon leads, temperature follows. Way back in 1989, they had already decided that carbon led and temperature followed. We all know that that's turned out to be the other way around. Admittedly, they publish other stories where they talk about the Milankovitch cycle, and they quite accurately explain how that's involved with setting up and triggering the changes in temperature. But this is part of what they publish. We believe in the global warming thing because of graphs like this, which show how linked it is, and that confusing statement. They are still saying, this is in 2008, they are still using the words that the correlation is strong between carbon and temperature. And they at least link to an article which explains how the link is inconveniently an 800-year lag. They never just straight out say the link is, it's a backward correlation. I wish they would explain it straight. I don't mind the fact that they put up the AGW case, but I wish they would balance it with the other side of the story as well and just let the readers make up their own mind. So when did New Scientists get around to telling their readers about the lag? By 1999, so 10 years after that graph was published, it was pretty obvious that there was a lag, hundreds of years. By 2000, we still knew it was hundreds of years, but we didn't get the specific dates, I guess, till 2003. Kalon et al. Put out a paper saying there was 800-year lag plus or minus 200 years. They didn't mention that then, despite the fact that there's 18 mentions of the Vostok ice cores between 1999 and 2003. They talk about how deep the ice cores go exactly to the metre. It's kind of like the Guinness Book of Records of Vostok, but not the point that matters, the cause and effect link. 2005, of course, Al Gore came out with an inconvenient truth, and there was no mention of any problems with that. And 2007, New Scientist was inspired to finally put out some information about the lag. They were inspired by the Great Global Warming Swindle because it infuriated them, no less. They call that dangerous, despite the fact that it interviews real scientists, and Al Gore's movie has not one interview with a real scientist in it. They defended Al Gore for his movie, not once but twice. Al Gore in his movie says, when there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer. It was the only evidence he gave in his documentary. The lag proves nothing about carbon pushing temperatures up, yet Al Gore blew up the graph to 20 square metres. Well, remember that huge graph that he put forward? Where was New Scientists outraged that the scientific documentary deliberately turned cause and effect inside out? It was deadly quiet. Don't mention the lag. In New Scientists, you need a degree to disagree, but passion, faith and good intentions are all you need if you are a warmist. I wrote to the magazine to say, why didn't they put forward a story about Kalon et al. In 2003? Why didn't they announce the fact there was an 800-year lag? It seemed pretty material to the discussion of the topic. And they wrote back Why do you think we should have reported a finding that no scientists found at all remarkable at the time because it confirmed what we had always thought? Not according to their 1989 graph. In any case, no scientists, none, thought that it was important. This original paper was published in none other than Science itself, one of the top 5 big-name journals of the science world, and one which every boffin and his lab rat wants to be published in. It's a safe bet that if the editors of Science thought that this was common knowledge, they would have dropped it faster than a beer freezes in Vostok. And in cause and effect, the cause has to happen before the effect. It's basic logic and reasoning, and yet from a science magazine, we don't see this. He went on to say, the lag only became newsworthy in 2007. This is 4 years after the paper was published, when people began misrepresenting the science. Not when Al Gore misrepresented the science and forgot to mention inconveniently that the carbon rises after temperatures. That wasn't misrepresenting science. It was misrepresenting science when Great Global Warming Swindle came out with their documentary. So the news that was too obvious to mention in 2003 was later worth debunking because the dumb punters were starting to think the lag might matter. Ouch. Witness new scientists becoming the Politburo of science. We don't report the facts, but we will tell you what to think about them. By the time non-scientists thought to mention that there was a lag, Al Gore had already been misrepresenting it for 2 years, and they announced it with this snappy title, Climate Myths. Ice cores show CO2 increases lag behind temperature rises, disproving the link to global warming. Did you get that? God forbid that readers might be smart enough to make up their own minds and that New Scientist might give them both sides of the story. As far as New Scientist is concerned, you need a PhD to make a sceptical point, but if you're an ex-journalist who failed a theological degree and used to be a politician, you can make a movie on the topic, and even after a judge finds us full of errors, New Scientist will defend you. And the hockey stick graph, of course, we didn't read about that on New Scientist, although they didn't interview Steve McIntyre. Of course, they did interview Michael Mann and pointed out that he had been attacked for cherry-picking the data. This is the man who raises cherry-picking to new standards, who leaves out folders of data, packs them away and calls them censored, and claims he includes them. But he was attacked when people called that cherry-picking. Non-scientists, ever the cheerleader soldiers on, they're still defending the hockey stick graph all these years later, and they still haven't interviewed Steve McIntyre. Oh, they have these great headlines. Of course, the skeptics keep getting killed. We're down to no wiggle room, no space, nowhere to turn. Climate change, skeptics lose another vital argument. Skeptics are forced into a climb down and nowhere to turn. We keep getting debunked for the final time again. What New Scientists don't report about is the vested interests that are going on. The ghost of Lehman Brothers and our friends at Enron, of course. But there's a new wave that's come into this that most people may not be aware of. Of course, it's the big silent array of enormous financial institutions behind the scenes. And New Scientist thinks they're being the ones defending the little guys because they're standing up for Hansen, who's only been in, 1,400 television interviews? They're defending the little guys, they think, against big oil, but they don't realise that the big guys are really big banks and the little guys are really the unpaid bloggers like Steve McIntyre, who work to get donations on their website, while the guys like Hansen share in the $2 billion a year funds that the government puts forward. So the big dollars in this are not with Exxon, as New Scientist keeps pointing out, the oil-funded deniers, who are not oil-funded, by the way. If anyone knows Exxon wants to fund any bloggers out there, I'm here. Big Oil spent $2 million a year, roughly. That's Exxon's contribution when they were making it. Big government's around about $2 billion a year. The big banks spent traded $120 billion last year, and it's climbing rapidly. And Big Barrack expects to get $645 billion for his tax coffers thanks to this. This is where the real money is. You can't pour that much money into a scientific debate, even with honest scientists on both sides of the question, without affecting the results. Because, of course, the scientists on the other side are only getting donations from bloggers on their websites. And there's 2,300 lobbyists at work in Washington as we speak. This has become a big industry. As scientists, we are so not the centre of the equation anymore because the little science is being trumped by big business and big bureaucracy. I think it could be the first time in history that governments set up agencies and bureaucracies before they needed to. And here's a quote from Bart Chilton, a commodities futures trading commission member. He said, "Within 5 years, I can see carbon trading being a $2 trillion market, the largest commodity market in the world." And there you have it, the largest commodity market in the world. All of the other ones you hear about today, this is going to be bigger. So that's where the real money is now. There's a lot of people out there just doing what profit makers would do. They can see a profit on the horizon, they're positioning themselves to get it. We can't fault them for doing that, but nor can we let them get away with it. Now, this is probably the most embarrassing thing for new scientists. They have pages up saying, how do you assess the evidence? How do you know who's right, these deniers or the real scientists? Listen to this. Relax effectively, says New Scientist. You don't need to think for yourself, just accept the word of a UN committee. This is a quote from New Scientist on how you figure out the evidence. Of course, few people have time to wade through the scientific literature, weighing up the evidence and trying to work out which findings have or have not stood up to scrutiny. Fortunately, when it comes to climate change, there is an organisation that does this for us. Is it New Scientist? No, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's right, they just cut and paste from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the ICCC, and call it journalism. This is not investigative journalism. It's being an unpaid PR group for a giant bureaucracy who doesn't need any extra help to get their message out there. Few people do have time to wade through the details, but that's why we buy New Scientist. We kind of hope the journalists will do it for us. So the slacker journalists are not even going to the original sources, but they're just cut and pasting from the officialdom and pretending that that's evidence. When they also advise people on how to assess evidence, that's one of their titles. Here's another quote. The first questions to ask about any claim is who is making it. How embarrassing. This is a science magazine. I think the first place to look at a claim to assess the evidence is to look at their resume. Does the claim, it gets worse, does the claim come from a scientist whose career is dedicated to studying the complexities of the climate, or is it the pet theory of one of the many amateurs who think they know more than the experts after a few hours of surfing the web? Amateurs. Good old amateurs, people like Edison, Gregor Mendel. If New Scientist was still in charge of things if they had been in charge of things in the 1800s, goodbye genetics, forget electricity, we'd be sending emails by horseback. But it's ridiculous. Amateurs versus pros. The amateurs have got no vested interest. They're doing it for the love of it. New Scientists should be one of the first to report that there are people out there who are so disturbed by giant government science that they're doing a lot of work in their own time at great risk with no guaranteed income and no guaranteed reward, and definitely the possibility of being bullied and intimidated into submission, and standing up to that. And who else would stand up for these guys? And the answer is there's no one standing up for them, except for us, I guess, ourselves. This, wave to authority, of course, Bishop from the IPCC. The instinct to herd seems to be strong. This is kind of a know thy enemy section. The people we deal with want to believe in authority. It's a good shortcut, and most of the time it works, but they're kind of being sheep. Just, don't tell me to think, just give me the answer. And there's a reason for it. We all have mirror neurons. When they do neurological studies of people, they show we have mirror neurons. When we fit with a consensus, we get a bit of a dopamine buzz from joining in. Or maybe we don't, because we're the skeptics. Maybe we miss out on that. And everyone else is just living with their biology, kind of getting that rush. There's also the Milgram experiments. Do you remember these from early 1960s? They got someone in a room who thought they were testing for memory, and they said, you just need to give them electric shocks so they can learn things. The actor in the other room, they didn't realise was an actor, was going, ow, screaming in pain and shock, and meanwhile people ratcheted up the doses of electricity to help them learn. The question at the time was, how far would people go? How many people would obey authority? The Yale guy in a lab coat? How many people would just assume that that was right, even though they were causing the victim pain? The experts of the day, the consensus was it would be less than 1%. In reality, 65% of all people obeyed authority, of the 40 people in the test. Only one guy stopped before 300 volts. The rest, 65, administered 450 volts. Such is the power of authority. They effectively killed the volunteer. They didn't want to do it. They were in pain. Some of them were in tears, but they still obeyed authority. And that one guy who didn't obey was, by the way, an electrical engineer. There's so many engineers here. He said, I know what 280 volts does to you, so I'm not doing it. He was the one who stopped. Without Yale, the numbers dropped to about 47%, and people, the fact that they weren't responsible helped them. We have to make people responsible for thinking, to get them to assume the responsibility of making up their own minds instead of being sheep. Deny tactics, of course, is just a straight ad hominem. New Scientist has started using it since 2006. Funny how the evidence gets less and the tactics get more and more nasty, isn't it? Here's a quote from New Scientist. As for the comparison, a reader wrote in and said, why are you using the words why are you using ad hominem attacks like this? He wrote back and said, as for the comparison with Holocaust deniers, is it worse to deny facts about mass deaths in the past, or to deny facts that if we fail to take action will lead to mass deaths at some point in the future? That's right, he can equate people who did die, known deaths of children, women and men from 50 or 60 years ago, to possible deaths of people that might happen based on a computer model sometime in the future, and call that the same? Is it worse to throw away 2 millennia of educated reasoning, or to scare people with completely unsubstantiated claims? Who's the denier here? Per person who asks where the evidence is, or the person who denies that they need to provide any? Okay, of course you won't see these graphs in New Scientist. There is no hotspot, but there is no story about it. So New Scientist has helpfully written Climate Change, a guide for the perplexed. Unfortunately, it was written by the confused. We laugh, don't we? But this is really sad. This is a failure of modern journalism. Look at this. Yes, there are still big uncertainties in some predictions, but these swing both ways. In the real world, both ways means up and down. In New Scientist, the response of the clouds could slow the warming or speed things up. That's up or up more. And yet it looks like a balanced statement. If you were reading this casually, you would think, oh yeah, they're looking at both sides of the story. They're not. But New Scientist subscribers are rebelling. They've, not surprisingly, they've had enough. Excuse me, I'm going to finish, I think, on a few quotes from New Scientist subscribers. If you look at their blogs, lots of the subscribers are writing in, are complaining, are pointing out the holes in their logic and reasoning, the fact that they're not using logic and reasoning, and thank goodness for that. Some of them have come up with some real treasures. Here it is. New Scientist posted the Al Gore pledge. Will you sign the pledge to save the planet from global warming? And New Scientist subscribers wrote, I pledge to not travel to, attend or otherwise listen to a single Al Gore environmental concert to save more energy. I pledge to remain an independent critical thinker. I pledge to only consider actual measurements of data, not estimates, forecasts, models, guesses, speculations, predictions or prophecies of doom. And this one, I pledge, holy cannoli. You greenies are getting totally out of control. What's next? A secret handshake and a characteristic salute? Yeah, even the young subscribers have had enough. They're getting sceptical. And my researcher is still picking out holes in New Scientist, even though she can't read yet. New Scientist has become new activists. They support non-scientists, bureaucrats and banks. They promote fraudulent graphs and flawed analysis. There's the top 10 reasons to trust the UN. You'll find them here. Skeptics get debunked for the last time again. Find out why science documentary with real scientists could be dangerous. You might have to think for yourself. Feeling guilty, use your carbon footprint to feel good about doing nothing to help the poor. And looking for a logical fallacy, you'll find it here. We use all your favourite ad homs. We argue from authority and ignorance. It's embarrassing, isn't it? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to finish up on the last note. I just want to say that I don't think that these science journalists are doing this because of any conspiracy theory. There's no dark, underhand things here. They just want to save the planet with the best of intentions, and you know what they say about the road to hell. They're getting the dopamine buzz, they're being obedient to Milgram, but there's a status question here too. Oh, sorry, this is scientists doing research. Remember my comment earlier? The alarmists, they do research, they're Googling. The scientist says 24 degrees, I'm looking at a thermometer. The alarmist says, that man stole a bun in grade school. They come up with resume stuff. That isn't science, it isn't evidence. Okay, so how big is my handicap? If I was a peacock with a big tail, I'm showing off my sexual selection and my advantage. Hello, I'm carrying a huge handicap and yet I survive. And that's what this is about. The guy who buys a Lamborghini, he's carrying a huge handicap. He's paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for a car that you can't drive it any faster than anyone else because you're not allowed to. It's a handicap, but boy, do we know he's rich. But if you can't afford a Lamborghini and you're a greenie, you can always do the pink pig car like this guy. He's got two girls helping him paint it. He's showing off his handicap. I care so much about the planet. Who wants a Lamborghini? Who would own a thing like that? I care so much. I'm giving up my time to go to protest rallies and wave the placard, and that's about it, but I'm pretending. And that's what it's about. It's about dinner party status. They just want to impress their friends at dinner parties. I care more than you do. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.